Hot Air's Ed Morrissey on the state of the gun money race and the overall election. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America, especially if you're looking for a sober, serious point of view on the subject that focuses more on reporting and analysis than on opinion. This week, the show is brought to you in part by The Dispatch, which I'll talk a little bit more about them at the end of the episode. We have a good friend of mine I've known for a long time, who I have a lot of respect for, who writes over at Hot Air, Ed Morrissey, on the show this week to talk a little bit about the fundraising numbers that we've seen and perhaps the overall approach of either side to this campaign when it comes to guns, and you know, just give us a little bit different perspective. We've had David French on, we've had Tim Miller on, and not that I'm saying you're, wildly different from those guys necessarily, but I think you have a different point of view than they do, and I want to just give people the opportunity to hear someone else on this. So welcome to the show, Ed. Thank you so much for coming back on.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, Stephen. I do want to give a shout out to my friends at The Dispatch. I'm glad that they're sponsoring you. Jonah Goldberg, Stephen Hayes, and of course, my former writing partner, Nick Catoggio. I hope they're all doing well. And definitely you should go read The Dispatch. So there you go. Yeah,
we're doing a little ad swap. So they did that for us. We're doing ads. They're a little bigger than we are, so we're running more ads on our own. But you get how it goes. But for your part, tell people a little bit more about your own background.
Sure. I'm managing editor at Hot Air. That's been for the last couple of years, but I was senior editor before that, a senior editor. We just kind of restructured it when Nick went over to The Dispatch, actually. Mm-hmm. And we've got a great staff of writers. We've been doing this at Hot Air. We've been doing it since 2006. I've been there since 2008. But the
real institution on the online write-out.
Well, I certainly would hope so. Of course, we're part of the Town Hall Media Group, and that's part of the Salem Media Group, which has got the radio stations and everything else. And I've been doing this now for 21 years. In fact, my anniversary just came up at the beginning of the month. And so I've been doing this for 21 years. I did it independently for a few years, and I've been with Hot Air since March of 2008. So it's 16 years. Oh my gosh, it's the longest I've ever had one job, Stephen.
It's impressive. I mean, look, I came up reading your stuff. I think you were one of the first people I met in conservative media. One of the first analyst writers that I met at CPAC in probably 15 years ago now. I think it would be.
Yeah, we were all a little younger back then, weren't we?
But it was a very exciting thing for me. I've been reading your stuff when I was in college, and it was new to the whole political writing thing, and you were very friendly and helpful, as I think most people who know you would attest to.
Thank you.
And so I'm grateful for that. But I also, the reason I have you on the show is not just because I've known you for a long time, but because I respect your point of view and your analysis. And so let's get into that, right? Let's talk just first starting off here. We have a new piece at The Reload this week that talked about the fundraising race in the 2024 election between the various gun groups and how that has turned out. We've got basically the last FEC reports that we're going to get before Election Day. Now, they only date to the end of last month, not to, they don't count, they don't include October. We won't get those numbers until after the election is over, but they do tell a striking story, and one that we've been following really the whole year, which is that the gun control groups, the major gun control groups, Everytown, Giffords, Brady, have absolutely blown by the NRA in terms of fundraising and political spending in this cycle, and really for the first time in a presidential cycle. As much as the NRA was limited in 2020, it did actually still manage to outraise and outspend the gun control groups in that time. And additionally, when you look at the other groups on the right, or on the, I know the right is maybe not the proper term, maybe the pro-gun side, not always a left-right thing, usually is, but
usually.
But there have been some groups that have come up. The United States Concealed Carry Association, National Shooting Sports Foundation has PACs. GOA had a pretty big donation to its Super PAC this last month. But they really aren't filling the gap that the NRA has left behind in its decline. So
yeah.
What do you make of where the money race is at?
Well, what I would say is that with the NRA taking a big hit, just because of the struggles that the NRA has gone through, I think it's going to take a while to settle out where the advocacy money is eventually going to go, right? I mean, I think that it just takes a while, Stephen, for people to find what channels that they want. And I think that one of the things that is interesting, and it's always been interesting to me, is that each of these groups are a little different. They have different focus. They have different priorities. Gun Owners of America was always a little bit more sharply activist than the NRA was in terms of, I would say, a little bit more absolutist than the NRA was in terms of...
no compromises there. The whole tagline,
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole Dudley Brown thing and that sort of thing that was going on there. And so I think people just need to feel comfortable. And I think also, too, I think that the issues that were at the NRA probably made donors uncomfortable with the movement in general. It's one of the things that happens when money gets mismanaged or misused, whatever it is that you want to say that the NRA did with it. I think that people get skittish about sending money into any sort of similarly situated group. So I think you're going to go maybe a couple more cycles before people start really feeling comfortable about putting money in an organization that they can trust, A, that they can trust, and B, that they think can be effective. Because, if you're going to drop a bunch of money into a group that's sort of, I don't want to say fringe in terms of policies, but fringe in terms of impact, right? Small groups that don't have a lot of impact. I mean, yeah, you can, if you drop a lot of money in there, you can then have a great deal of control as to how that group uses it. But it may not, you may not get you may not really get a whole lot of juice out of that squeeze, I guess you can say. That's the analogy, I think, these days. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, sort of thing. So I think it's just going to take a while to do that. But I think that overall, while the gun control groups are outraising, and I think that that's not necessarily new either. I mean, you got Michael Bloomberg, that's a big time donor into this. You've got, I think,
that's one of the interesting things. Just to supplement your point here, because yes, gun control groups are the funding mechanism for them is very different, right? Yes. I would say than the gun rights groups, which is part of what you're getting at here, right? Like one of the reasons the NRA has struggled to raise money is because they've lost 1 million plus members. And that's where they have to raise their PAC money from, is from their membership. So they just have a smaller pool to pull from, and the other groups haven't made up that gap in time, like probably for a lot of the reasons you're talking about. But at the same time, the other effect that we're seeing is that Bloomberg and the other people who fund gun control organizations have actually stepped up in a significant way compared to, for instance, 2020. Every town said at the beginning of 2020, I think it was around February. So there may be some obvious reasons as to why this didn't happen, but they claimed they were going to spend $50 million in that election, and then they didn't. This time around, they've claimed that they're going to spend $45 million, and it does seem like that money is actually coming in and being spent. So that is another aspect of this. It's not just the decline on the gun rights side, it's also a following through of these big dollar promises on the gun control side. And look, not everybody who donates to gun control groups is a billionaire. It's just a large driver of their donations for sure.
Yeah, well, and umbrella groups like Arabella that primarily are set up by, large money sources, and then also still get smaller money donations or manage smaller money storefronts, I guess you can say. If you're looking at Arabella, they like to set up a lot of these little micro storefronts for each of these little issues. And gun control is one of them. It's not the only one. Arabella plays across a wide spectrum of progressive causes. But you got that money coming in too, and you've got these other smaller storefronts that are more targeted for particular campaigns and that sort of thing. But at a certain level, we can have a discussion as to, once you get to a certain level of money, how much difference is there in impact? Like if one side's got $10 million for a targeted campaign, the other one's got $50 million, is it really 5 times the impact? Or does it just become part of the ubiquitous background noise and voters are just slogging through all of it? I mean, this isn't about guns, but I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about Texas this time around, and I live in Texas now, I live in central Texas, and Colin Allred's all over it's all over my TV. Ted Cruz hasn't really been until about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So he got a ton of money and he's spending it. I think there was a question as to whether Beto O'Rourke was spending the money 6 years ago when he ran against Ted Cruz. Well, Colin Allred's spending it. You can see he's on television all over the place. But I don't necessarily know how much of that is actually going to impact the race, because you're still dealing in an election cycle, you're dealing with a whole set of values that voters are relying on to make those decisions. And when it comes to gun rights and gun control, it's really a core value for people on both sides of that question, right? I mean, there's certainly room in between for suggestions for compromise and that type of thing. But at the core, what you've got people who really want to restrict ownership of firearms, and you got another set of people who don't want their ownership restricted. And I'm not sure how much money is going to come into play when it comes to election cycles, or maybe more on policy, maybe more on pushing policy in Congress, but and it's certainly funding challenges in the courts. But I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to play a huge role when it comes down to voter choice. I think that's really more about a core value type of decision.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting point of view. Like, at what point does the money race stop? Meaning, like, where is the point of diminishing returns in this?
Exactly.
In this stuff. And I think that certainly is a big question generally in politics, and definitely here in this. I would say, I guess on that point, one of the things that I'm noticing and that we've reported on is, I guess, the distribution of money, right? Like, they're not all just spending, directly in the presidential campaign, although they are spending there. It's more of it appears to, from what we're seeing in FEC reports, the Federal Election Commission reports, that, the NRA has taken a much more targeted approach. They're going after Tester, right? They're going after Golden, the congressman in Maine.
Right. It's actually one of the more moderate Democrats in the House too, which is kind of interesting that they're going after.
Right. Yeah. We had a really good, we talked about some of the news update, but we also had my contributing writer, Jake Fogelman, did a good analysis piece on that race, because it is one of the key races in the House, and also one of the only ones that seems to be centered around gun policy, because one of the things Golden did was change his position on the assault weapons ban after the Lewiston shooting, because he represents that district. So, that'll be an interesting one to watch for sure. But the NRA seems to be targeting these specific key races as their main strategy. They're not really trying to do a broad spend. And then if you look at Everytown and Giffords, they're much more taking a broad approach. They're even spending in things like school board elections. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think of that? Is that an area where money can give you an advantage because you can do just more things further out than just the presidential election or something? Yeah.
I mean, or Senate elections for that matter too. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how much diminishing returns, I think, is a really interesting question in terms of John Tester, because he's going to lose that race anyway. Right. I mean,
probably.
So maybe you don't spend it there, or maybe you don't spend as much there. Maybe you spend some of that, if you're the NRA, you spend some of that on House races or state legislative races. And I think that the lower down you get on that hierarchy, the more impact you're going to have, because there's less money in those races. Right. I mean, but I don't, the school board thing, that might be a sort of a reductio ad absurdum, because school boards don't really have a whole lot to do about gun policy. Sure, I'm not even sure what the point of that would be.
I guess school security or something along those lines.
Sure, but I mean, honestly, that's I guess so, but I don't know that that's
it is one of their smaller campaigns. It's just an example.
Right.
Like they're spending millions in the state races that you're talking about.
Yeah.
They're spending six figures in school board stuff. But
I'm a little mystified on that particular part of it. But they have a lot of money and they have to figure out where to put it.
Right.
And the more money you have, the more you can roll the dice on some of those things. Maybe they're doing it as sort of a test thing, and if it pays off for them, they'll come back and do more of it. And if you've got the money to do that, why not?
Yeah, the one of the other differences with Everytown is that they seem to be much more into sort of coalition spending.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of spending in conjunction with other groups, and that actually kind of obfuscates a little bit how much of the money is coming from them and how much is coming from this group that's trying to influence school boards or like this. They partnered with the Senate majority PAC for Democrats, and they're spending millions in that partnership. I don't know exactly how much is coming from Everytown, but that is one of their things, is that they're trying to go out and find ways to work with other groups. They're even, oftentimes, and I want to get your thoughts on this too. One of the other differences we see this cycle is a more heavy reliance on other issues in these ads. Now, Everytown has been doing this for a while, mostly with abortion, and they're still doing it in a lot of their ads this cycle. Mm-hmm. The NRA does it as well to some degree. Look, the NRA does it with crime. A lot of their ads have led with crime and then followed up with gun rights. And there's obviously an argument that those things are more closely connected than abortion and gun control. But they're both kind of leaning on an issue outside of their main issue to try and influence these voters with these ads. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that. I mean, is it because the gun policy is just not a top priority in this election, or it's not the first time Everytown has done this, or the NRA for that matter, but
yeah, I think that there's a relevance issue that's going on here, because I don't think in this particular election that the Second Amendment and gun rights has really been a big issue. And if you take a look at the issue sets in the election, I mean, the big issue sets are the economy, immigration, crime, and abortion is kind of down the list. I know Democrats have really been flogging it, and they used it effectively 2 years ago in the midterms. But I think that that's kind of played out, and I think people are not necessarily looking at that. But let's just say it's a top tier issue in this election. And so if you're Everytown, what you might want to do is you might want to create some sort of brand loyalty, I guess you could say, or maybe just some sort of close tie between people who are close on abortion, who make abortion their key issue, and bring them into the gun control community. And that would make some sense. And again, if they've got a lot of money to spend, again, you do that and you see if it succeeds. And maybe this is another pilot program that they're running, or maybe they've done it before and they found it effective too. But you can see why. You can see why they would try that. Why that would be an attractive strategy for them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it feels like they look at the issue list that you just described, and look, it doesn't change that dramatically from election to election, right?
Right.
What you'll see oftentimes, and it depends on the polling, and there's all kinds of caveats to all and nuance to all this stuff, but usually economic issues are at the top of most voters' lists most of the time. And then you get things like immigration or crime or abortion or guns can jump up there a little higher depending on the exact news cycle. But
yeah.
But
I mean, I will say there's one other thing too, though, Stephen, that's in play, I think, with the Everytown strategy of tying abortion to gun control, which is that they want both of those things to be within the purview of the judiciary rather than state legislatures, both of those issues. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense if you're saying that we need, nominees, Supreme Court nominees, appellate court nominees that are going to put abortion back into the realm of the judiciary, by reversing Dobbs or somehow, trying to challenge Dobbs for overturning it. That's the same mechanism that you need to deal with Second Amendment issues, to reverse McDonald and Heller and Bruen. You need to go back to the Supreme Court and get them to reverse those precedents. So it's really the same mechanism. So there is a natural alliance there that you can develop, I think, by tying abortion and gun rights together, because they're both looking to use the same mechanism, the federal judiciary, to achieve their policy ends. And I mean, I think that that's not a legitimate way to do that, but certainly I understand that it's a strategy for them. It may be the only strategy they've got, because I don't think either one of those things can really advance in terms of state legislatures in the way that they want it to advance. So, that makes, considering it a little bit more, it makes even more sense to me that they would try that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you mean on like the national level, because they are working in state legislatures.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean they're gonna work to like
blue state thing.
Well, it is, but I mean
not national.
But
change.
To get to their policy ends, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way that they see this, they're going to have to go back and get the Supreme Court to. They're going to have to change the judiciary. So it makes sense. That's true for both of those things, for abortion and for, Second Amendment issues, because of the various different Supreme Court decisions that have been handed down over the last, 10, 15 years. McDonald was, it was 2008, I think.
Heller was 2008 and then McDonald was 2010.
Yes, Heller was 2008. So, I mean, you need a different Supreme Court. You need a different federal judiciary. So you need, presidents that can appoint them, and senates that will confirm, more activist, progressive jurists for that. So it makes sense. It makes sense to tie those two things together. And I think that that makes a little bit more sense than maybe I thought at first blush for them to
But I also think it's something that voters who abortion messages appeal to probably are also going to be more supportive of gun control as well.
Probably, yeah.
And maybe they look at the polling that you mentioned earlier with the interest in each issue, and they see that abortion is at the moment driving those sort of voters more than gun issues are.
Yes,
and so they want to put that at the top.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
That's my guess, at least. And the same thing for the NRA. Like, crime is, in recent years at least, I don't know how it's shaking out at this exact moment, but certainly earlier in the year was a much higher concern than guns. So I guess a similar play. But I don't know what. And then I guess that can lead us into maybe talking a little bit about the presidential candidates and their approach to gun policy or gun messaging in this election, because there've been some interesting things going on, right? I guess one, we did a whole podcast with Tim Miller on Harris and what she's doing, because it's a bit different from what you've seen from Democrats in the past. I mean, not totally different. It's not the first time a Democrat has said, I own a gun, so don't worry about me.
Joe Biden said it too. Yeah.
Similar argument, Joe Biden, Tim Walz's basic argument that he's used for years. Harris's is a little bit different, in my view, because she owns a handgun and she owns it for self-defense, whereas usually Democrats are talking about how they own shotguns for hunting, right? What do you make of that message, and the potential impact of it? Who do you think she's trying to reach with it, and do you think it's working?
Well, no, I don't think it's working. I don't think anybody is going to trust her on this, because she won't explain why she was trying to take away that same class of handgun, earlier in her career. She's never actually explained what's changed. And I don't know that I'm going to doubt her that she says that she owns a handgun. If she says she owns it, that's fine. She owns it. But we're only hearing about this, the last couple of months? Prior to that, she was sort of the standard progressive on gun control. She wanted mandatory buybacks, which is basically gun confiscation. Anytime you say mandatory, it's confiscatory, right?
I would say she's even left of most Democrats on that issue.
Yeah,
right?
And she's never explained why she changed. She's actually never really honestly said that she has changed her mind on it. But even to the extent that she's suggesting that she hasn't explained why. She hasn't explained, why a mandatory buyback wouldn't work in her mind. I know why it wouldn't work. I've got lots of research. I could talk about that for quite a while, why it wouldn't work. But but she hasn't explained why she's concluded that it wouldn't work and it wouldn't be good policy. And it's one thing to change positions, maybe one or two positions, as long as you've got a pretty good explanation of why. And Donald Trump changed his mind on abortion, and he had a pretty good explanation of why. This was 9 years ago. I see a little
Kind of
skeptical
changed
look.
again.
No,
But yes,
he's
I get-
kind of, but he's
I get
kind
what
of
you
done
mean.
is said, I did what I wanted to do on abortion. I sent it back to the states, and now I don't want to do anything else on that. And that's
Right.
frustrating some pro-life allies.
Sure.
But honestly, that was kind of what the goal was. I mean, that was what the pro-life people told him the goal was, or at least the near-term goal was to get
Well.
Roe reversed so it can go back to the states. And he's basically saying, well, I took you at your word, and now I don't really want to mess with it anymore. Okay, fine and good. It's a position. I understand why
Sure.
some people are unhappy
Yeah,
with
and
it.
we don't need
Right.
to debate it. It's
Right.
not part
But
of
he-
what we're focused
But he
on, right?
explained it. He talked about federalism, and he
Yes.
talked about how California isn't Texas and Texas isn't Massachusetts, and he wants the states to deal with this. But she really hasn't explained her reversals on gun policy and on other policies as well. She's just, and to a certain extent, she's not even iterated a change in policy. These are changes that have been leaked from the campaign to media sources who then report, oh, she's changed her position, but she's never actually firmly done that herself. And she doesn't get asked a lot about that. And when she does, she changes the subject. And that's the reason why I think I doubt very seriously that any gun owners trust Kamala Harris to suddenly be a moderate on guns. You know, the irony of this is that Tim Walz actually probably qualifies because Minnesota has a pretty strong gun culture. And at least until I left in 2021, I didn't really see Tim Walz messing around with it too much. I don't think he and the Democrats, when I left, I don't think that they had full control of the legislature either. And maybe it's changed since I left in mid 2021. But I think he kind of understood that, you know, in Minnesota, it's just a little too strong to mess with. That's a you know, shall issue, carry permit state. It has a strong gun culture. It has a strong hunter culture. It has a strong self-defense culture. And it has a responsible community of gun owners there, which I was very proud to be part of for quite a few years until I left.
Yeah, I mean, Walz, I guess I believe they passed a type of expanded background check under him, and they haven't done things like an Sullivan's ban, to your point.
Right.
Although he does support it now as the VP candidate, but
I don't think he'll push it in Minnesota. You know, for the reason that it's just not practical. I mean, what they're calling, I mean, we could talk about this all day long, but what they're calling assault weapons are commonly held weapons, which under McDonald, I believe, you know, you're not going to be able to sustain a ban on them. They're commonly held weapons.
The Supreme Court hasn't ruled on this yet, but that is what a lot of people believe they would.
I believe
the direction
that's
they would
where
go.
they go.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's interesting, right? I mean, and I do agree that I think that's one of her biggest weaknesses as a candidate is just a lot of really what you might call baggage, and that she was a much further left Democrat previous to 2020 than she's certainly running as today. And she doesn't, like you said, she hasn't explained a lot of these things in detail. And I think at the CNN town hall, she had finally come up with at least more straightforward answer for why she changed her mind, which is basically just that she's, since serving as vice president, she's come to view things differently in some areas, but obviously still a pretty generic response.
It's not really an intellectual explanation of I was at point A and now I'm at point B, and this is the logical steps that I took to get there.
Right.
That's a political expediency argument, and I think that that's one of the reasons why people don't trust it. Because if the political expediency cuts in a different direction at some point, she's going to go in that direction too. And you know, probably that's true of a lot of politicians, but at least most of them cover their bases a little bit better than she does on that. So
I guess she kind of just wants to, like I would imagine a lot of politicians, she just wants to kind of make the change and get past it and not talk a lot about it.
Well, I think that's more. I think it's less than that. I think she just doesn't want to have to say things that are going to cost her votes.
Right.
And so she just simply is trying to tell people what they want to hear, but she hasn't actually changed at all.
Yeah. Because the other aspect of her talking about this, like the main reason she talks about being a gun owner, right, is to counter this idea that she's going to take people's guns because she supported mandatory buybacks. And then obviously we broke the story that she had supported a handgun ban in San Francisco.
Right.
Although we just published some new, the Free Beacon had an audio of her talking about how she doubted the constitutionality of gun bans. So she has this record, and she seems to be using her gun ownership as a way of trying to deflect criticism of the record as being too far left, as wanting to take people's guns. I agree with you that I don't think people who vote on gun rights and gun policy who are gun owners are going to buy a lot of that. But I get, it seems to me like she's trying to make comfortable some people who are disaffected by Donald Trump, maybe Republicans who are disaffected by him, or moderates who are worried about him, but also think maybe she's too radical. Do you think it has any play with those people?
Well, on the gun thing specifically, maybe not a ton, just because it's not a big,
it's
huge
part of a
issue.
Broader argument,
right? But but she's done this on practically every position she's ever taken, especially from the 2019 election when she was running as a full-blown progressive for the presidential nomination. She was in favor of Medicare for all. She introduced a bill for Medicare for all, which would have, brought socialized medicine to the United States. And it would have, her version didn't make private insurance illegal, but it would have crowded out private insurance in short order because the government would have undercut the pricing on it. That's the public option thing that came up during the Obamacare debate in 2009. And,
yeah, she's done this. There's been a bunch of positions where she's had to say banning fracking.
Fracking's another one. Yes.
We just had another one with school resource officers where in 2010, when she was San Francisco DA, she argued that there should be more of them. And then in 2019, one of her problems is in 2019, she was very definitive about a number of these things.
Right.
Where she would just say, I want to ban fracking. I think we should get rid of all school resource officers. And now she's saying, I don't believe those things. But she's being a lot less definitive about it. You know what I mean? Like it's obviously harder to walk back something so definitive, like some of these comments she made in 2019. I guess that's what you're getting at, right?
That's what I'm getting at. And what this does is it undermines confidence in her that whatever she's saying this time around is going to stick. And again, I think you can change positions on a couple of items. As long as you get a good explanation for those. But if you're changing all of your positions wholesale over a 5-year period and you don't want to explain why you did that, it looks very much like you haven't actually changed your positions at all. You're just lying about where you're at right now, or you were lying back then. It's one or the other, and because it's just across the board, embracing diametrically different policies on each of these issues, that there's really very little confidence. As a gun owner, I have very little confidence that Kamala Harris is not going to try to use federal power to restrict, to unconstitutionally restrict the right to keep and bear arms. And I have very little confidence that she's actually a convert on that particular issue, and on the others as well.
No, I mean, it's hard to disagree with any of that personally. It is. It's hard to. It feels like a politician saying what she needs to say to get elected. It's hard to trust that she means these moves to the center on some of these issues, and additionally on gun policy, she hasn't moved that far to the center.
Right.
She still supports universal background checks, some sort of national red flag law, and an assault weapons ban on sales, not without the mandatory buyback, I guess.
Now.
Right.
Now.
That's what she's currently running on, and my only point there is just not that. She's not making policy moves to try and appeal to gun rights voters at all. Right.
Yeah.
It's just a rhetorical thing to try and, I think, give people who don't vote mainly on that issue some comfort in turning to, or at least being, less worried about her coming for their guns, right? That's what it's designed to do. Whether it works, I guess, is the question. And that's what you're saying. You don't think it works that well.
I don't think it's going to be effective. No.
Yeah, and then obviously we can just turn to Trump. And his strategy on guns this far in the race has, I'm interested in what you're taking away from him, because you're somebody who follows politics very closely, certainly, but you're not an everyday gun news writer. So
Right.
I'm interested in what's breaking through here. But to me, it seems like he's primarily running on, or what he's primarily talks about with guns are two things: that gun owners don't vote, and they need to. This is a thing he says, to be fair, about several groups, whether it's Jewish people or evangelical Christians. He'll say they don't vote. You need to vote. This is the last. He sometimes will say, "This is the last time you'll need to vote if we win," which is not a comforting thing, I don't think. But and we'll get into some of that stuff later. But and then the other message is that Kamala Harris wants to take your guns, and so I don't know. That's what I'm getting as far as he's not up there giving detailed policy analysis either, right? But these are the basic positions that he seems to be putting forth most of the time that relate to guns. And is that what you're seeing? I mean, what are you, what's breaking through, I think, to the larger political news cycle here?
Well, I know he's talking about guns from time to time, but it's not really a focus of his campaign either.
No.
I mean, he's only talking about guns, I think, and to draw a contrast on Kamala Harris's, past positions on it, which is,
Right.
certainly fair. But, he's president for 4 years. And I think at least, if you're a gun owner, I think you felt pretty comfortable during those 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like we're not going to know what Trump will be like as a president on gun issues. I think that he probably is. I mean, he's basically running to say, I'm going to go back to the same policies that I had during my, whether it's economic policies, whether it's foreign policy, border security policies. He wants to go back to what was working for him in those 4 years and what he claims is no longer working because Joe Biden, Kamala Harris reversed all those things. So I think that there's a level of comfort there that you don't necessarily need to hear from him every day on those things. I seem to recall, and you can maybe correct me on this, that he got crosswise with the NRA early in the primary cycle on something, and I forget what it was. And this is before we're actually getting into the voting. So this would be like late last year, maybe a year ago or something like that. He said something and the NRA was like, whoa, wait a minute. And I forget what it was. Might have had something to do with universal background checks. It's dim in my memory. And then they went and, clarified, no, that's not what he meant. And I think to some extent with Donald Trump is he says things because he knows that people are talking about things and he wants to try to be a little bit all things to all people at times to his detriment. And I think that's been true on the abortion issue, which is one of the reasons why the pro-lifers are kind of unhappy with him at the moment. And I seem to recall that he had a moment like that with the gun rights lobbies, but I can't remember that.
I think the biggest thing in terms of backlash during the campaign from gun rights organizations was maybe two things. There was obviously, because look, Trump, I guess your point here is he had a pretty good record as president on the gun issue.
Yeah.
Mainly, I think people would point to his appointments of 3 of the justices that were in the majority in Broome, right? That's his big program.
Same thing with abortion. Yeah.
Same thing for abortion, yes. And outside of that, one, there wasn't a lot going on in terms of legislation. He signed a bill that repealed a late stage Obama administration Social Security gun restriction that by the time it got passed was pretty watered down from what it had originally been. But and then the other thing he did that does bother at least some gun rights activists, perhaps not every gun voter, but was the bump stock ban. Right.
Yep.
Which was found unconstitutional by the justices he appointed. But which he has continued to say he supports. So that was an early thing during the CNN town hall. I don't remember if the NRA came out. The NRA was actually somewhat in favor of the bump stock ban at the time. They didn't like the final version of it, but they preferred executive action to legislation. And then the other thing that he did that did get actual backlash that I recall from the campaign, at least, was during the campaign, was support for stop and frisk and taking people's guns.
Yes.
Stop and frisk. That's something that he had said during the campaign. It also mirrors to some degree comments he made after Parkland, where he was arguing in favor of essentially red flag laws, saying, take the guns first, have due process second. This is kind of a view, you can see this view across Donald Trump's comments, but he kind of believes that police should be less restrained in a lot of ways, including, stop and frisk, which is a policy that, of course, was based on New York's very strict gun laws, because it was very difficult for a regular person to get a gun carry permit. Mm-hmm. So the way stop and frisk worked was anyone who was carrying a gun in New York City was almost certainly doing it illegally because you couldn't get a permit. So they would just stop and search you for a gun. And if you had a gun, they don't have to prove it that you were trying to commit any further crime than just carrying a gun. So,
well, and there's some civil liberties issues that are involved in that too, which is that, you're not supposed to search people unless you have probable cause to think that they're breaking the law. Or reasonable suspicion, excuse me. I think it's reasonable suspicion. And,
right. I mean, Trump's argument is that the police know the local people who the bad guys are, and so they should be able to search people and take their guns.
I am not a fan of. I'm not a fan of that. I know that there are people who are, think that that's a good crime fighting thing. Rudy Giuliani being one of them.
Sure.
But
those are the big.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, those are the things that he's gotten some criticism policy-wise.
Yes. Yeah.
Because for the most part, the gun rights groups are supportive of Donald Trump. Whether people think that's the right move or not, that's the reality of where.
Well, I think it's a reality of a binary choice, right, Stephen? I mean, you've got Kamala Harris on one side, you got Donald Trump on the other. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump has been clearly going to be the nominee. Right from the very first primary, it was pretty clear that he was going to be getting the overwhelming support of Republican voters in the primary cycle. So they've been, you have to pick and choose your spots, right? So if they oppose certain things that he says, they'll lobby him on those things. But they know that, especially in a general election, that they have two choices, and one of them is Kamala Harris, and the other one is not Kamala Harris. And I think at this stage, regardless, and I'm not suggesting that they're uncomfortable with Donald Trump. I think they're probably pretty comfortable based on the 4 years that he was already in office. Mm-hmm. But just on the basis of endorsing the not Kamala Harris, I think that that's the reason why they're going with Trump.
Right. I mean, that's one of the issues we've talked about this with Cam before. One of the issues of the polarization of the issue and sort of partisan capture of your favorite issue. Is that you kind of end up having to go with whatever that party decides. But
so I'm not even sure it's partisan capture. It is to a certain extent on abortion. It is to a certain extent on gun rights. But I think that most of these things get litigated in primaries. And what I mean is that, in parliamentary systems, usually you have multiple parties. I mean, the Israelis are famously fractious, right? I don't know how many parties they've got. They got a lot of parties, and they do list elections and all this kind of stuff. In Canada and in the UK, it's a little bit more stable. Parliaments are a little bit more stable because they're down to maybe 3 or 4 parties that will compete for actual seats in the parliament. And so they have the elections in the constituencies or I forget what they call them in Canada, but basically what we would call the congressional districts, in the districts. And then after the election, they form coalitions to see if they need to have a coalition government or if they need to strengthen a slim majority party. They'll have negotiations about who gets what cabinet position and all this kind of stuff. In the American system, it's the other way around. You have your coalition fights in the primaries and before the primaries. But when you get down to the general election, for the most part, in a two-party system, you've got a binary choice. So there's really no jockeying around at that point. You certainly, as an interest group, can say, we're not going to put money into the kitty for you. We're not going to run advertising in support of you unless you're willing to do this, that, and the other thing. This has been, we see, again, on the Republican side, we see this with some of the pro-life groups, is that they've been reluctant to spend, or at least early on, they were reluctant to spend because Donald Trump had kind of said, I've gone as far as I'm going to go on this, and that's the end of it. Leave it up to the states. And they were kind of unhappy. Now, I think that they've all decided that the choice, again, is either Kamala Harris or not Kamala Harris, and they're going to go with not Kamala Harris.
Yeah. And look, I think it's, well, go ahead, finish your.
I was just going to say, it's not so much ideological capture, because they're having those negotiations before the primaries and in the primaries by backing various different primary candidates. And it's most visible with the presidential campaigns, but it's also happening with House elections and Senate elections, state legislative elections, probably especially. By the time you get to a general election, I mean, those debates are over. You've got the you go to an election with the coalition you have. It's sort of like the old quote about war. And so I think it's kind of over by that point in time.
Yeah, and I think that's the practical reality of where things are at. I'm just saying, I think if your interest is mainly, like, if you're mainly just care about gun rights, if we're no, this is not a real person, right? Because like people care about all kinds of issues. But if you're looking at gun rights, what you would ideally want is for both parties to be pretty close to where you are on that issue, instead of one party you basically have to choose that party. Because you look at the Kamala Harris, Donald Trump lineup on policy, and I think it's, while there may be things that you could criticize Trump for from a program perspective, it's not it's an obvious contrast. Right. And it's not a hard choice if you're just looking at the policy side of things. Right.
Well, no, and I think you're right about that. And you take a look at Israel, for instance, right? I mean, for decades, the parties were very close on foreign policy in regards to Israel, right? Yeah. And there wasn't really a dime's worth of difference between them up until the time that Barack Obama got elected president. And all of a sudden, there's been a significant divergence. Now, do you think Israel's happy about that? Hell no. Right. It destabilizes that alliance. Now, it does allow for more debate on it, but I mean, as a part of the interest, as a part of the person that's up there, the person that's got the interest in that thing, no, you're exactly right. I would much prefer the situation in American politics pre-Roe, where both parties were against abortion. I would much prefer, pre-1960s, I guess, where both parties were pretty much in favor, supportive of gun rights. Well, we don't have that anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But that's a problem for us. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's all I mean by it. Like, I'm not like, and I think you'd rather be closer to where Israel is, because while there is a difference between the parties, there's still, you don't have just Democrats' position on guns, I think, is further.
Oh, absolutely. No, I agree with you on that. Yes, yeah. I agree with you on that. Yeah. But I'm just using it as an example. Yeah. 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 And so that, I mean, that I guess brings me to maybe the last thing I wanted to address, because this is something where, okay, the policy differences are pretty obvious and pretty stark between these two candidates. The argument that we've heard from people like David French or Tim Miller is that, these are second level differences, right? Policy distinctions, policy contrasts are not as significant as some of the other things going on in this election, like, the fallout from January 6th, Trump's comment that John Kelly, his former chief of staff, saying he's a fascist, his authoritarian tendencies, Trump talking about, using the military to go after his political opponents, those sort of things. They're saying we should put aside some of, there may be stark contrasts on gun policy, but there are other concerns that are greater than that. I just wanted to get your take on, you don't have to sit here and endorse candidate or whatever, but I just wanted to get your point of view on it, because we've heard their point of view. And I think it's persuasive to a certain degree, but I want to hear your point of view. No, first off, I think anybody that thinks that Donald Trump is a fascist really has never studied fascism. Calling him Hitler is about the worst demagoguery that you can possibly engage in. The Nazis were a very specific evil, millions of people died at their hands. It was based on an ethnic determinism. It was an ideology of ethnic determinism, which unfortunately still resonates in lots of different ways, and it's not only on the right.
Sure.
The idea that Donald Trump is going to go after his enemies is, that was based on a comment about how he might call out the military or the National Guard to deal with riots in the event of his election, right?
Well, he has said that the enemy within includes elected Democrats, right?
That's not unprecedented because
Sure.
on his inauguration in 2017, you had Antifa and other radicals burning Washington during the inauguration. They were rioting. They were trying to stop the inauguration. And that's why you call out the National Guard, is to deal with those situations. And he's also talking about the George Floyd riots, when he wanted to call out the National Guard and got a lot of resistance from blue state governors who didn't want that to happen. And as a result, you had these, insurrection zones that lasted for months in some of these places. I lived near the Twin Cities. That George Floyd thing, the George Floyd zone was basically an insurrection. They were rejecting the local government and insisting that they were going to run that themselves. That's an insurrection. Besides which, for the last 2 years, ever since it was made clear that Donald Trump was going to run for office again, this administration has been using their power to go after him. They got the Department of Justice operating 2 major cases against him. You've got Letitia James suing him in court over an absurd allegation of fraud in which nobody lost a dime, and the people who were supposedly the victims want to do more business with him. You've got the whole thing with a ledger entry on an NDA payment being blown into 34 felonies by a Democratic DA, and you've got the mess down in Georgia where you got a RICO case that doesn't have anything to do with income. So, I look at the allegations that Donald Trump is going to abuse his power to go after his political opponents as something of projection, because that's what we've been seeing over the last couple of years from Democrats. Once it became known that Donald Trump wanted to run for another term of office, that's when all of these things started rolling out. It didn't start out before that. And I will tell you something else too, because I've had these conversations with people about this, is that we have seen all of the things that I just outlined go on with the broad cheerleading of the mainstream media on these things. I would say that if you elected Donald Trump, the institutions would snap back to checking power rather than cheering it on. And I think that is a worthwhile reason to not allow the continuation of this administration into the next term. And frankly, I started off this cycle being very reluctant to vote in the presidential election, and I'm a lot more enthusiastic about casting a ballot than I was at the end of it, because this administration has abused its power. Its allies have abused their power at the state and local levels in order to interfere with an election of a guy who may not be a very good president, but at least is the choice of the people who nominated him. And he's running against somebody that didn't get a single vote for that nomination now. Not one single vote. Kamala Harris didn't get a single vote for that nomination, never even ran for the office. And yet she has been, for the first time in modern American history, and I would guess throughout history, an incumbent president who ran for and won his party's nomination has been pushed out of the election in favor of somebody who they wouldn't even do an open convention to nominate. That to me is a really huge issue. That to me is a threat to democracy. And I am very concerned about that. I would much rather vote for the guy who at least has some sort of connection to an actual vote for nomination, and somebody who adheres to Federalist principles in practice, even if he shoots his mouth off stupidly. And I will agree that he shoots his mouth off stupidly when he's bantering with people. The 4 years that he was in office, You didn't have fascism. A dark night, a night of darkness did not descend over the country.
But I mean, after he lost the election, he tried to overturn the results, and that concluded in a violent riot at the Capitol. Right?
Well, okay, so it did. There was a violent riot at the Capitol, right? There was a violent riot on January 20th, 2017 that tried to stop his inauguration. It was exactly the same scale. There was more damage done in that riot than there was there. And in 2020, you had riots break out all across major cities where people were seizing turf and declaring themselves to be in charge of it. And nobody except for a few of the arsonists ever got charged. Nobody got charged in the 2017 riot. Not one single person got charged and convicted in the 2017 riot. The Department of Justice dropped all the charges because they just didn't want to go through the hassle of prosecuting people for stupid political beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess bottom line for you, it sounds like one, you don't think he committed any crimes during the attempt to undo the previous election, and two, you don't think that the things he says about going after enemies within, like Pelosi and stuff, that they're real.
No, they're not real. That's him shooting his mouth off. But I mean, if you want to see how people go after their political enemies, take a look at the Jack Smith indictments. Take a look at the absurd Letitia James fraud trial, the Alvin Bragg trial, where they created 34 felonies over ledger entries that, even if they were crimes, were misdemeanors. Take a look at the RICO indictment in Fulton County, Georgia. Those are abuses of power. Those are Democrats going after their political opponents. And then on top of that, take a look at the attempts to censor debate and dissent on online forums, including Facebook, including Twitter, until Elon Musk bought it and exposed it. Until then, the State Department under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were engaging in censorship of American political debate. And then tell me which one of these guys is the fascist.
Well, I mean, I certainly have a very different view on this, and I think Donald Trump, what he says and what he might do, honestly, it scares me. But
honestly, if I had my druthers, they would have nominated somebody else. I didn't vote for him for the nomination. I understand. But again,
this is why I want to bring on somebody from a different point of view, right? Because I don't just want to be like, hey, everybody who agrees with me on the issue, especially we're getting a little bit outside of gun politics.
But
some people say we should think about these things. But
I salute you for that, though. I mean, I salute you for having this conversation.
I'm just trying to be honest. We don't endorse candidates. I try to stick to policy and analysis, but I don't want to lie to people about what I'm feeling.
Right. Exactly. I don't. I've made this sort of a policy, right? Which is, we don't really do endorsements at Hot Air. Mm-hmm. What I will do is I will reveal to people what where my vote's going to go. But I don't, the Washington Post today, right? Speaking, we need to remain independent, so we're not going to issue an endorsement. Does anybody really think the Washington Post is independent just because they didn't issue an endorsement? Of course not. But I don't believe in endorsements either. I mean, I tell people just for disclosure purposes, I'll say, well, I voted for Trump, or I voted for Ron DeSantis. Full disclosure, I voted for Ron DeSantis in Texas's primary when it didn't matter anymore, but I still voted for him. So, that's a disclosure issue. I'm totally fine with that, but I don't do endorsements because I don't think, I think it's sort of presumptuous. You, Stephen, should vote for, Jill Stein in this, what is that?
I mean, look, I think everybody should vote the way that I think that I'm going to vote, but that's because otherwise I wouldn't vote that way, right?
Well, but that's the reason why you make the arguments.
Of the reload to me.
You make arguments for that, though, but you don't say, you as my reader should vote in this.
I demand. What is that? Look, I don't begrudge people that have opinion section, editorial sections, and they want to do endorsements, and that's fine. I just think that the reload, what I'm trying to do with the reload is something a little bit different. It's focused on hard news and analysis. And look, I don't want to be, but at the same time, I also don't want to sit here and try to pretend that I don't feel the way I do about certain things. And so, look, I think we've gone through, and you've given a pretty passionate explanation of how you're viewing it, and I've tried to do the same here in terms of what I'm thinking. And look, I appreciate you coming on. There's somebody I have a lot of respect for, and so I want people to be able to hear from people that I trust to be honest and say what they're thinking. And I think you've done that, right?
Well,
so, and we talked. This was just the last couple minutes. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff where I think we have a pretty good agreement on. In the first
it's totally fine. I'm totally cool with this. I'm just waiting for 2029. Or 2029. Well, getting past another election cycle, but in 2028 at least, maybe both parties will do a little bit better in 2028. We'll see.
Maybe. I mean, I agree with you in terms of like Harris's weaknesses. We just disagree on, I guess, Trump's what level of threat we should think of Trump or of Democrats. Because like I don't disagree with the number of your points on her, and I've never voted for a Democrat, so I'm very reluctant to do anything like that. And I live in Virginia, so it's another thing of like, I might just write someone in again. It just, his rhetoric and stuff scares me. January 6th is something that has stuck with me, and I understand.
I can appreciate
discounting it, but
I can appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, I do, and I appreciate the fact that you're approaching this in such with such equanimity. And that you're willing to have this conversation. So
and look, we're going to continue to cover whatever the administration ends up being, whoever it ends up being. I'm going to cover them, aggressively and try and be somebody who breaks news about gun policy. That's what I want to. That's what we want to do at the Reload. And we've covered Harris. I mean, like I said, we were the ones who confirmed the 2005 story that I got the sourcing to show what her position was. And look, our latest stuff, I don't think it even cuts. We talked about it on the news update, but I don't even think it necessarily cuts on a specific partisan line, because it's interesting stuff that she said that's a bit different from some of the things she said later, but could people could take it a lot of different ways. In fact, on Twitter, when we tweeted out the story about her wanting more school resource officers in 2010, like the partisan reaction to it was like, it's very confused as to what we were trying to do, because everyone thinks you're trying to thinks you're trying to push a story one way or the other, and sometimes it's just, here's information about the person who might be president. Like, this is relevant and interesting.
Yep.
Take it how you may. It's your decision, not mine.
Well, I appreciate the fact that we can have this discussion. I appreciate your reasons. Look, I mean, your sponsors over here, the Dispatch, they don't agree with me either, but they're good guys. They're good guys. Right. I consider Jonah a friend. I consider Nick Katojo a friend. I consider Stephen a friend. So I'm just going to throw this in at the very end. The Dispatch, go read them. They're intelligent guys. We just don't agree in this particular cycle. We're going to agree on other things in the future, though.
For sure. And man, I might not even have to run the ad now. But just to close things up here, why don't you give an ad for Hot Air and where people can find more of your writing if they'd like to do that.
Hotair.com. I'm on Twitter at Ed Morrissey, 2 R's, 2 S's. But go to hotair.com. That's where all the writing is going on. And, we've got, John Sexton. We've got David Strom. We've got Beej Wellborn, who's a lot of fun. We've got other contributors, and we've got our VIP Gold, VIP Platinum program now. So if you like what you're seeing over there, there's more stuff behind the paywall. There's plenty of stuff outside of it, though. We're committed to making sure that we have a large amount of our stuff outside the paywall. So come on by to Hot Air and check us out, hotair.com.
Awesome. Highly recommend it. And speaking of publications, I highly recommend, I'm going to send it over to myself to do our official Dispatch ad. All right. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Olive Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news, in the same way that we do here at The Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.